To give you a little background, I sold a company a few years ago and I've been very interested in disruptive technologies. And so I spent time doing some research in this area, built a few drones and all sorts of different activities like that, because it seems to me that there are a lot of things ahead that are going to change the world, both from an economic perspective and also from a social perspective. And so, based on my own experiences in business, I looked at this and I said, what are they? But more importantly, what particular larger area is going to be impacted not by one, but by the intersection and the reinforcement of all of these different technologies. And when I looked at that, the thing that really came to the top of the list was driverless cars. But more importantly, not just driverless cars. It isn't just about technologies and how those fit together to create a very effective new technology, i.e. driverless cars, but what the underlying business model. Is there also a disruptive business model that really makes that successful? And so these are different areas that, of course, everyone has seen. They're things that are really changing so much of our industry and so many different industries, but the thing that is going to be disruptive for the automotive industry isn't just those technologies. It is a business model, a disruptive business model. And that business model is essentially an Uber-like service, but not just Uber on steroids. And Uber on steroids, in this case, is driverless cars, but driverless cars implemented in a particular way. My background is business and investing and starting companies. The first thing you do when you're starting a company is you create a business plan. And so before I started writing this book, I sat down and I built a business plan. That was the thing that really motivated me to write this book. There were two things about that business plan that really struck me. One is that it had a compelling value proposition. There was a strong reason why people would buy this service. But the second thing about it that really struck me was the fact that it was going to have some very negative and very serious consequences to other industries. So, here is sort of the bottom line of that business plan. You could deliver these sorts of services, mobility services, for as little as 30 cents a mile. So imagine Uber at 30 cents a mile. And if you told the system, the dispatching software, cloud-based dispatching software, that you are willing to share a ride, it will find someone who lives near you, it will find someone who lives near your destination, it will automatically make that match for you because people hate doing that themselves. It's one reason why there's so few carpools. And you can then deliver that same service for about half that price, 15 cents a mile. So if you have a 10-mile cab ride, you would pay $1.50 for that 10-mile cab ride. That's fairly disruptive in itself. But beyond that is this issue of what is that value proposition. Surprisingly, I found for a lot of people it goes far beyond just price as to what makes a difference. But if you look at price, in the US there's a company called Consumer Reports, it's a magazine, and they do an annual study of the cost of car ownership. And they break that down into different areas: depreciation, fuel, maintenance, insurance, interest, and taxes. And when they look at that, they assume you own that car for a period of time and then you sell it. They look at what you get for it, what you sell it for. This is a total cost of ownership of a car. For a median sedan in the US, it's about a little over $8,000. And that's assuming 12,000 miles of use during that year. Well, if you have a car all by yourself that is at your call 24 hours a day, that you don't have to deal with in any other way other than to punch a few phones on your cell phone, that's $3,600 a year. That's your personal vehicle. Or if you'll share it with one other person, $1,800 a year. Financially, that's pretty compelling. So you can get safe, efficient transportation for half to a fourth of car ownership. Now, there are people out there who love their cars and love driving. And this is not their solution. But there's a lot of folks out there that only care about getting from point A to point B. And if they can sit in the back of the car and have a conversation or do whatever they want to do, surf the web. If they want to watch cat videos, they can watch cat videos. If they want to take a nap, they can take a nap. And those are things that are very compelling to a lot of people. If you look at the younger generation, that old younger generation story here, if you look at people between 16 and 19 years old in America, half of those people, even though they're eligible for it, do not have a driver's license. That is how disengaged. They don't know, not only do they not know who Mario Andretti is, they don't know who Jimmy Johnson is. And they couldn't tell you or describe a part of a car. They're just disinterested. There's a whole group in the younger generation that are coming up that aren't passionate about cars the way I was when I was growing up. But they are passionate about having to pay an enormous amount of insurance, for example, for their cars. But there's less congestion with these, there's less pollution, they're all electric vehicles, and we'll talk briefly about why. You get faster commuting, and you never have to drive around looking for a parking space. How many people have spent a lot of time doing that? Not only that, you don't have all of the hassles associated with ownership of a vehicle. You don't have to stand in line to get your license plates. You don't have to do all of those other things that make it less of a joy to drive that car. But you also have a very low stress experience. As opposed to public transportation, you're not sitting waiting for the train to leave. In this case, you basically have a door-to-door service. You punch it up, they show up, you get in the vehicle, you tell them where they want to go, where you want to go, and it goes there. And so it is a far lower stress environment, and stress is actually a killer. There's a good Wall Street Journal article on the impact of stress and heart disease, among other things. So, how do they operate? I think we've kind of described that, but a lot of it really has to do with how efficiently they do that. How long does it take for them to arrive? Well, if you have a sufficient market share in an area, you can get a car there within 3 minutes. Not only that, if you look at where a lot of human voice interfaces are going, it's 5 years out or more for these, you'll be able to have a conversation in any language with this car. There's no reason why we won't have very good technology for that. It can even recommend restaurants or tell jokes for you. So, what are the market segments? When you're looking at starting a new business, one of the things you always want to look at is who is going to buy this service. If you can't answer that question, you should not start your business. The early adopters in this case, the younger generation, the millennials. Okay, a lot of those are people who are more interested in getting from A to B than having that whole experience. But also seniors. Seniors are usually laggards in the marketplace. But in reality, seniors, when you get to be a certain age, you get this visit from your kids. And it's not a pleasant one. It's about, Dad, you need to give up driving. The problem is when you give up driving, you give up a lot more than that. You give up much of your own personal independence. Because if you can't make a trip to the grocery store, if you've got to call and beg your kids to do that, your quality of life just fell through the floor. But if you look at this opportunity, you basically can give your keys up without giving up your personal independence. And you'll be able to live in your own home for years longer. For a lot of seniors, that means they live longer because they have a reason to live. They can still go to the bridge party. They can still go to the golf club without having to depend on their kids. The disabled, if you can have on a 24/7, I was talking to a guy in a wheelchair when I was leaving an event not long ago, and he looked up at the guy who always drives him around. He said, I love this guy, but I tell you, if I could any time of the day, 24/7, dial up a car, have it come up, pick me and take me wherever I want to go, and know there was going to be another car to bring me back, he said, it would change my life. And it will change the lives of a lot of those folks. For low-income people, suppose you are a single mom and you have to go and wait for a train, you have to get there a little early, and on its schedule, then you go where you're going. And then at the end of where that train station is, you've got to get to work. That limits a lot the jobs that you can have. But if you can get door-to-door service, not only can you spend more time with your kids, but you then can have reliable transportation to a job that is ideally the job you've always wanted to have. And then there is that group called the alcohol impaired. That's good. Sometimes it's a little too good. And so if you're going to a bar, your friends get together, hire one of these vehicles, it takes you to the bar, you have as much of a good time as you want to have, and then you know you have a safe ride home. Not just safe for you, but safe for everybody else that's on the roads with you. There's a second group that's called the early majority. Those are commuters and businesses that have a fleet of cars will be able to use these cars much more effective, much more cost effective, and much more practical. But also children. You know, initially people are going to have a little heart palpitation, the idea of putting their kids in one of these cars and sending it off. But after a while, when they've seen enough of the cars out there, they're going to be a lot more comfortable with that. And then, of course, the skeptics are always the last one to come on board, and the people will never come on board are the people that truly love driving. So are they safe? Are these cars safe? Well, let's look at a few initial results, all right? First question you have to ask yourself is, are the cars we have right now safe? And the answer to that question is not very. In the US alone, 33,000 people died last year, and 250,000 people were hospitalized. A lot of those people that were hospitalized will never work in their jobs again. A lot of those people had a change of life that is just a terrible change of life for them. If you want to look at what those numbers mean, 33,000, yeah, that's 2 3s and 3 zeros. If you look in the last century, in World War I, World War II, Korea, and Vietnam, every major war America fought in, they lost in those wars. Right now, we have lost in this century, in the entire 20th century, but in this century, the 21st century, we have already lost more people to car accidents than we lost in all of those wars in the 20th century. In fact, we've lost 128,000 more souls than we lost in combat in all of those wars. If you look at why we lost them, it's almost always due to the driver. And these are the reasons. Distraction is number one. 43% of these accidents are caused by distraction. And I think distraction has gone through the roof since we got these and we bought them for our teenage children. Because I tell you, you can sit down and say, hey, do you know how dangerous this is? Today in America, this is the leading cause of death for kids, 19 and under, right here in my hand. It's not the leading cause of death or the leading cause of car crashes. It is the leading cause of death. And it is dangerous. And yet, lecture all you want, they'll smile and nod, and as soon as that text comes in, they're right in there. So drowsiness, drunkenness, and driver error. 93% of accidents. Driverless cars don't suffer from any of those problems. So, just as an example, Google, you may have heard, has been at this for quite a while. It's about almost 7 years now. In that time, they have covered over 2 million miles. And in those 2 million miles, they've had a total of 16 accidents. No deaths in any of those accidents. In one of the accidents, there was an injury to the guy who rear-ended their car. And in 12 of the 16 accidents, they were rear-ended. They keep essentially a 3D view of everything around them out to about 200 yards. And from that record, they're able to determine exactly how that accident happened. So that's going to be kind of tough on personal injury attorneys because there's not much arguing. Eyewitness reports are reliably inaccurate. But when you have a whole movie of everything that happened, that's quite a different story. So, hackers. Everybody talks about hackers. We've all seen the stories in the media. There are a couple of guys who have gone in and hacked a number of cars, taken over the steering, taken over the brakes. And in fact, if you look at today's cars, this is not a driverless car problem. This is a car problem. Today's cars have a lot of computers built into them. In fact, a lot of cars today have like 100,000 lines of code in them. So if you look at the ability to get at that, unfortunately, it's easy already. But with driverless cars, they're going to be held to a higher standard. Uber, in fact, went out there and hired the two guys that were the big hackers that were demonstrating the problems. Smart PR. A number of companies that are looking at getting into this business, such as Google and Apple, have been running cloud services for some years. And believe me, if you run a cloud service, you had better be able to stop hackers. And so they've invested millions of dollars over the years to build very effective firewalls. In fact, one of the things the Google car does is thousands of times a second, it examines the software that's running the car. And by examining the software, if it sees any difference from the software that was originally loaded in that car, then it automatically stops the car, pulls the car over and stops it. So once again, the standards for accidents and the standards for things like hacking that driverless cars are going to be held to are going to be much higher than the standards that just ordinary cars are held to. So who's going to benefit the most from this? Well, the first is the public, for a variety of reasons. We talked about the different groups within the public that will benefit, not just because of the cost. In fact, cost isn't insignificant. If you look at the impact of having, say, $5,000 more in disposable income every year, that's a pretty nice holiday. It's also potentially savings for your kids' education. You could even take your garage and turn it into a spare bedroom or whatever else your heart intended. Airbnb, yeah. You could rent that room. And then you get $8,000 a year, and the problem's just worse, because then you got to figure out what to do with more money, right? So the other beneficiary, though, are taxpayers and the government, because with these cars, you actually will relieve congestion for a variety of reasons. We talked about some, we can talk about more, but you relieve congestion. That means you need fewer examples of highway expansions. Well, one of the biggest causes of highway expansions is one of the biggest causes of congestion is highway expansions. If you've been on roads where there are work crews that are doing this or that, that's a pretty big problem. The other one is accidents, and if you have fewer accidents, then you're going to have less congestion. So the environment is the other big winner. Downtown developers, of course, and there is a huge economic benefit from that consumer savings. Although you will take jobs away from people, there are negative consequences in this. There are also significant benefits from all of those savings. They will go back into the economy. So I mentioned electric. Why electric? Well, here are basically the reasons. If you look at this as a business problem, the first thing you see is that compared to even a hybrid, the economics of electric vehicles are just that much better. So why doesn't everybody drive an electric vehicle? They don't, because they're worried about range, because it's kind of new and weird. They're not used to that. And there are a few other issues with electrics that they're concerned about, but none of them are relevant to running a car sharing service like this. When you look at this business, it's just obvious. Maintenance costs, for example, on electric vehicles. I happen to drive a Nissan Leaf. A Nissan Leaf has, in my case, a 30,000 mile service interval. Imagine that. When I say that, I see a lot of auto dealers go like this, because that's so much of the money that they make is from providing those kind of services. So that's a piece of business that goes away. That is a threat. And the vehicle life is very long for many of these cars. There's no reason why it shouldn't be. If you look at electric motors are sealed units. You don't change the oil in an electric motor. You don't go in and do anything with the fluids. You don't even open it up. And some of these motors can last for hundreds of thousands of miles. So there's a long life. There's also a decline curve on batteries that has happened in the last few years, and that appears to have the potential for happening quite a bit more, especially with this gigafactory that Elon Musk is building. So we should continue to see some drop in that as well. There are already cars that have been announced for around 2017 that have 200-mile plus range. So it's not unreasonable that by the time these cars are really out in any numbers in about 10 years, you'll see ranges about 250 miles. But the bigger reason that range doesn't matter is you're just renting a car. It's going to take you from here to there, and that's all. And so the software that is managing, that's doing all the scheduling and everything, it knows exactly how much battery life is left there. And it is set up so that the consumer never has to think about that. The other thing is CO2. Well, if just in the US, if there were a 50% adoption of these vehicles, there'd be over a 7% reduction in the amount of CO2 that's going into the air. Not only CO2 in this case, but also nitrous oxides and sulfur dioxide and a lot of other things. So you can imagine that these cars would be told, go charge yourself. They would go to a charging station, they would back into a plug, and they would charge themselves, and when their software said they were charged, they would leave and the next one would pull into there. So their charging facilities, instead of like I have one facility at my home, in this case they would be constantly in use and shared. If you can get up to about a 250-mile range, then you can decide when you're going to charge. The best time to charge is when the prices are lowest. And the prices are lowest if you're in an environment where you can negotiate that with a power company. For example, the industrial price for electricity at 3 in the morning in Colorado is about 5.5 cents versus 10.5 cents. So you can cut your fuel costs in half. So impact on congestion. When you can share information among vehicles, you know where the congestion areas are. And so instead of piling in there and adding to that problem, you can bypass that. You can know the whole road network and know where you want to be. So there then are fewer cars piling into that congestion because they're bypassing it. When you have accidents, for starters, they'll have fewer accidents, but when you have accidents, they'll also know where those are and be able to bypass them. Less highway expansion means funding for road repair, so the road quality will be better. And finally, there's platooning. I'm sure if you looked at many videos online, you've seen these platoons of cars that are essentially like trains. When the first one hits its brake, the last one hits its brake about a millisecond later. And so they all are able to act together. And now the bad news. I needed a drink first. Each one of these mobility services, because they're going to provide services for multiple people, will displace as many as 7 cars or SUVs or whatever that are already out there. So what does that do to sales? Well, and honestly, the numbers of almost all the other analysts are higher than 7. I'm fairly conservative in this book. If you take 7 cars out of the market, you also put 5 to 7 cars into the used car market. They don't just disappear. And so suddenly, you're talking in this case about a very serious impact. We'll talk a little more about that on the next slide, but just broadly, the oil industry, the insurance industry, local bus transit service, and a list of other areas are also going to be impacted. So the mobility vehicle market size is really not that big. If one of these cars can service 7 cars, you can't say, oh, we're going to go in the business of building these cars and in any way reduce the number of sales, well, reduce by 1 the number of sales that you otherwise would have had. If you were selling 7 cars and now you're selling 1 car, that doesn't really help your case. Not only that, you're selling 1 car that's designed to last for some years. So a 25% US market share would eliminate demand for 62 million conventional vehicles. That's of concern. Used car prices will fall. That's going to hurt new car sales. And because these are very low maintenance cars, and because they rarely ever have collisions, that's going to be bad news for the people that repair cars. Let's think for a moment about the global oil industry. I spent a lot of years in the global oil industry, and I know a lot of my friends are still there, and I think there's some bad news ahead there as well. It's already very weak due to market oversupply. We've seen the price of oil tumble, and we'll talk a little bit about why. But if half of the US vehicles were electric, if they gained that kind of market share, 2.33 billion barrels of oil a year would be displaced. And in that 2.33 billion barrels of oil, you would have net zero US oil imports as a result of that. That's not something that would only happen in America by any means. America's just there as one example of how that impact occurs. If you look at Saudi Arabia, and we'll look at several countries just briefly with one graph, but Saudi Arabia has about a 70-year supply of oil at its current production price. It's 70 years. How many people think 30 years from now that oil is going to be in demand? So what is that going to do to the stabilization of the Middle East and the Saudi government? Will they ever be able to sell that oil? Well, this slide tells a little of the story of what's going on in a lot of other countries. So we're looking at 2 things here. We're looking at the percent of tax revenue and the percent of export revenue for these countries: Russia, Iraq, Nigeria, Saudi Arabia, and Venezuela. So 60% of Russia's revenues come from the sale of oil, their tax revenues. Furthermore, oil service companies are about 15% more of that. Iraq, forget it. Nigeria, largest country in Africa by population by far. A country who half of that country's population is Muslim and half of that country's population is Christian. There are in almost all of these countries very extensive social programs that are funded by oil. So you take all of these countries, Nigeria, Saudi Arabia, Venezuela, and you take away those social programs, there's a serious destabilization of a lot of those governments. I'm just saying, it is a serious concern. When I wrote this book, just to backtrack a little bit, I didn't write it as a way of pumping up driverless cars or even driverless car mobility services. I wrote it because I also felt there are some serious consequences to all of these decisions and that we need to think through this problem holistically. These are some of those consequences. The insurance industry, to quote Warren Buffett, it being driverless car mobility services will be very good for society and very bad for insurers. There'll be fewer accidents. There'll be fewer injuries. If you want to go in there and decide you want to vandalize one of the driverless cars or steal it, you walk up to a car that's just studded with cameras, 3D cameras that has the ability to call the police when it sees you doing something wrong. It's not a very attractive proposition, although I would say, having read a lot of stories about the criminal mind, they'll probably try it anyway. They're just not real smart people. But all of those low risk are going to drive a lot of mobility providers. If I were running this business, I'd look at it and say, I don't want to buy insurance, I want to self-insure. If I have enough vehicles in my market, I'm crazy not to carry that risk myself. Local transit, local bus transit specifically. This is one that I really struggle with, because I know buses are a big part of a lot of people's lives. But when you really look at that, I mean, like in Denver, for example, the ticket prices only pay 23% of the cost of the bus ride. The rest is a tax subsidy. Well, for less than that 23% bus ticket, you can provide door-to-door services on a 24/7 basis anytime people want it. They don't have to know anything about bus schedules. They just pick up their phone and say, I want to ride. And it's cheaper than it is for them to buy a bus ticket. They don't have to think about schedules. They don't have to wait for buses. They don't have to make transfers. It's door to door. It eliminates that whole first mile, last mile problem. And frankly, if you are a tourist just coming into town, if you've ever gone to a strange city and tried to figure out their bus schedules, it can be challenging. Everyone manages to do it differently. There's another case, and that is things like light rail, or rail services more broadly, or subway services. Those are not going anywhere, and we need to find a way to make sure that those remain a healthy part of our transportation infrastructure. And so part of what the book includes is a model where you're using these vehicles, rather than to compete with them, to create an intermodal system of transportation, where these vehicles will feed those existing investments in transportation infrastructure like subways and light rail and trains. And if you do that, it makes it very attractive, because these little cars will know exactly what the schedules are. They know exactly what the traffic congestion is in the area. They can pick you up at your house and take you directly there and drop you off right at the train and then take off. They don't have to park. We don't have to worry about that parking infrastructure. So it could be a very efficient model for mass transit. And also, taxis. Taxis, there's just no way they can compete with this. Uber drivers won't compete, although Travis Kalanick has said that he plans to replace all of his drivers. I don't know if he let them know ahead of time about that, but that's what he said. Personal injury attorneys, I'm not going to cry any tears there. Parking lot owners, emergency services, physical therapists. So when are we going to start to see this? Well, not next year, but it's not too far away. I mean, we already have a lot of tests out there on the road from a variety of different companies where they're developing and testing these cars. The real question is, what's the rate of consumer adoption that we're going to see? So will it be a gradual rate of consumer adoption, or will it be a lot more like Uber? And when it happens, no matter how long it takes, it will be a very economically challenging time. If you have a job, if you're working building cars, then if this is a correct analysis, put the big if on it there, it's going to be hard to see how that job is not threatened. Or a lot of other very good, high-paying jobs in our industry. And so that, I don't know the answer to that, but I do know that companies will find new business models. They'll have to. And there'll also be a lot of economic stimulus. All those people that are not paying $8,000 a year for cars, but are paying $3,500 or $1,800, that amounts to a net of about $600 billion of, at least just for the U.S., in after-tax money that's going in people's pocket that is going to eventually create a lot of jobs. But there are also likely to be millions of people in all those different industries that will lose jobs. When you look at this, I think there are two thoughts I'd like to leave you with. And the first one is that just new business models can be just as disruptive as new technologies. If you look at Uber, all that is a new business model. They didn't invent any cars. They didn't really invent much more than an app on a cell phone. And yet their valuation is what? $45 billion plus? New business models that really disrupt industries can have huge values. And this is a combination of that Uber-type business model with a lot of other technologies that we're seeing here in the New Mobility World show. And there are a lot of companies that are working hard to do this. And then the second thought is, how fast did Uber propagate? When was the first time you heard of Uber? And how fast has Uber become a part of how so many of us function? And that's it. That's my story. I don't have a lot of answers, but what I try to do in this book is I try to lay out, here are the issues, here are the opportunities, and here are the challenges that we'll see ahead. Thank you very much.